You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Libertarian Country is one of the fastest growing and most popular liberty-themed apparel companies in the world. This American-based company was founded by two brothers out of Baltimore who had a vision to create an online store that offers fun, unique, and controversial political clothing and accessories. This five-star company offers the hottest shirts, hoodies, hats, and so much more. So check them out today. This is an independently owned, liberty-loving business that basically gives you the exact type of apparel and paraphernalia that you've wanted anyway. You just didn't know you wanted it now. Every purchase you make using the link in the show notes allows a small part of your purchase to come back and support the show. So go grab some awesome Libertarian Country swag using that link in the show notes. You'll thank me later. Real fast, let me go ahead and tell you about InboxDollars. Are you looking for a side hustle so easy you could do it while sitting on the toilet or in between commercials watching your favorite show? Unless you're like on demand and commercials are like an ancient thing to you, hear me out. InboxDollars has your back. For 20 years, InboxDollars has paid over $59 million in cash rewards to its members for doing everyday online activities such as reading emails, taking online surveys, playing games, and watching videos and TV. They also have ongoing promos and contests for members to win money online. And they share the top ways for people to get beauty samples, free printable coupons, and other free online stuff. With so many easy ways to earn extra cash online and having fun in the process, it's no wonder Forbes, Mashable, Bustle, and so many other trusted outlets name InboxDollars the easiest and fastest way to earn money online. If you're looking for a way to influence future products and services while getting paid at the same time, then InboxDollars is for you. Click the special link in the show notes of this episode today and get $5 just for signing up. Get this $5 signing bonus just for creating an account. That's InboxDollars. The link is in the show notes of today's episode. Get it, get your $5, and get started.
Prepare yourself. You're on the run with Remso W. Martinez.
Folks, I've got a story for you. It takes place in the amazing year. Well, any year is amazing compared to now. It takes place way under back in just 2018. Me and my friends are driving from Washington, D.C. up to New Hampshire to work on a campaign, and somebody did not plug in the GPS correctly, so we got to go through an amazing tour and driving experience through the one and only New York City. And guess who was behind the wheel? Yes, it was me. And no, I did not run over any bums or any pedestrians. I only had several people to attempt to throw a bagel at me, but other than that, it was perfectly fine. But what was even stranger than just the, peculiar driving habits, I can only equate to that of a Mad Max experience. That and, the tolls that seem to pop up around every alleyway, corner, and trash can you go through. Just the billboards alone that, typically you wouldn't think of, like $300,000 for a one-bedroom apartment near Manhattan. I don't know if they happen to be selling cocaine, children, and guns, but it seemed a bit too high. And I only thought to myself, well, obviously that must be one really nice one-bedroom apartment. To only discover through Zillow that night that it was pretty regular, probably worse than what you'd see over in Georgetown. And, 300,000 was not that crazy compared to the comps of the area. And this thought has been haunting me for years, like a bad Freddy Krueger nightmare. And it wasn't until recently I came across a video asking something which spoke to my heart, yet also lit to my fears. How the hell does Spider-Man afford to live in New York? That's the topic that got me interested in today's guest, Mr. Nolan. Nolan, thank you so much for joining the program today. And I've got to ask, as you were setting up your series discussing the crazy housing situation in New York, I think for the rest of us living down south, it's definitely something that we hear about. But when you actually broke down the numbers of what it's like for a normal everyday person, like, dear God, that's horrible.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's truly incredible. New York City is increasingly unaffordable. to regular people. And this is, of course, true of San Francisco. It's true of a number of cities, particularly along the coast. And really, it's a function of just underbuilding. It's incredibly hard to build in these cities, mainly because of the regulations such as zoning, which don't allow you to build more housing. And so we can get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, just so you know a little bit more about our guest today, Nolan Gray, you're over at the Mercatus Center right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually just left.
Oh, okay. So what are you currently doing, and what's really kind of your area of focus right now?
So I'm a professional city planner. I was a city planner in New York for a little bit, and I just finished up a little bit of time as a fellow with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I'm about to hop over to UCLA to start on a PhD in urban planning. But I've been doing a lot of freelance writing on city planning issues with a focus on housing affordability. Why is housing so expensive in a handful of submarkets? And one of the ways that I sort of communicate these issues is through this new YouTube series that we're doing called Pop Culture Urbanism.
Yeah, and I mean your video that you kicked it off with. One, I mean, as a giant nerd, as you could see behind me, I mean, when my only real understanding of New York, quite commonly for people that have never actually been to the city, has been through Marvel Comics. And it was always rather interesting to understand, kind of like the characteristics of these different areas of New York City, especially because you had Spider-Man over in Queens, you had Captain America in Brooklyn, Daredevil in Hell's Kitchen, and Luke Cage in Harlem. Then you had the Fantastic Four and the Avengers over in Manhattan. And, it always kind of struck a chord with me because, and so many other readers, because for Spider-Man specifically, I mean, he's just a working class guy. And, there was one part of your video specifically, and folks, I'm going to go ahead and link to this in today's show notes. This is what shocked the living hell out of me. And I know I'm kind of jumping into it, but this is just the thing that's been like keeping me up at night. You see it quite well when it's portrayed in Sam Raimi's 2001 Spider-Man film, where you see Aunt May and Uncle Ben and Peter just in their little, nice single family home in Queens. And I mean, up front, that the Parkers aren't necessarily rolling in dough. It's bit of a harsh living, just like it is for so many New Yorkers. But I mean, the cost of the mortgage that they would have to pay if they were living in that specific part of Queens is what got me. And I don't remember the number off the top of my head. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $850,000.
Like, unless Aunt May is turning tricks, like that's a lot of money for an electrician.
Right. I mean, we joked that it maybe would be affordable if Aunt May turned into a supervillain, right? Instead of robbing banks. But, it's clear that a couple like Aunt May and Uncle Ben bought their house, many, many decades ago when it was a very different situation. But, we sort of make the point in the video that someone like Aunt May really doesn't have anywhere to live in New York. She could enter a lottery for a subsidized affordable senior project, but, in a normal, healthy, functioning city, right? Like somebody with a pension and some Social Security coming in should be able to afford an apartment. Sam Raimi's, early 2000s Spider-Man trilogy is just dripping with housing politics. In Spider-Man 2, of course, Peter Parker lives in an SRO, or a single room occupancy. And, he has some vaguely Eastern European landlords who are constantly badgering him about the rent. And so, people, I always kind of start the topic. I'm like, hey, there's a housing politics to Spider-Man. And then people think, oh, this is like a gag. And it's like, oh, it's dripping with housing politics. It comes up in almost every other scene.
Oh, in Spider-Man 3, when Flint Marko is breaking back into his house to see his daughter and his ex, I mean, one of the things you see in the mail is constantly the eviction notices and everything else. And I mean, income inequality is a real thing. Now, what we think of when we think of income inequality is really, I think, pervaded by where we stand politically. As us free market libertarians, income inequality is natural to any free and fair society. Obviously, I would not classify the United States as like our quintessential free market, but we're better than most. We've got things to work on, but we're better than most. You have the ability to move up and down in this society, whereas for most of human history and through most of the world, even now, what class you're born into is what class you're probably going to die in. And when it comes to, your video, what this really shows me is that it's one of these situations, and it's always funny when you see the when you see the politicians, the de Blasios, but even going back to the Bloombergs and the Giulianis, you always have these ultra really smart credentialed people that come in and say they're going to fix the problems, but what they end up doing, for all their good intention, is they end up just making things more and more complicated. And you mentioned the senior project lottery that Aunt May could go ahead and enter if she wanted to go ahead and do that after Peter goes off to the city. I mean, we don't just do that for housing in New York. I mean, we do that in DC for schools. If you want to go ahead and try and get into a good school, it's based off a lottery. Now, you say this at a press conference and you go ahead and add a bunch of flowery language to it. That sounds great. Like, a lot of money must have gone towards that project, but you bring it up to just, everyday people who actually have to pay taxes and bills. And it's like, what the actual hell? This actually makes no sense in the year 2020. What's kind of the road leading to this massive housing situation we're seeing in New York alone? Because it's a great case study for what a lot of central planners want to do throughout the country when they talk about moving more people from the suburbs and the country into more densely populated metropolitans. I think now, in the case of COVID, we're seeing a lot of people from the cities flee outward. But this is something that a lot of people just don't understand. It seems to be something that, unless you're living in it, you'll virtually never even hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about the lotteries is a great point. I mean, if we have a program where it's being, something's being given out by lottery, this isn't a serious welfare program, right? It should be, you're either eligible for it and you get it, or you're not. Or in the case of schools, if there's such a demand for different schools, or if there's such a demand for a certain kind of housing, we need to be having a broader conversation about why it's not being produced without having this sort of crazy lottery system. And in New York, really the case is that it's incredibly hard to build housing. So they've adopted zoning codes, originally adopted in 1916, heavily revised in 1961, which make it very, very hard to build. If I was a developer and I wanted to build a senior project, and rent at market rates to seniors like Aunt May, it would be incredibly difficult to do that. Something like, a third of Queens, it simply wouldn't be allowed. Rentals would not be allowed at all. It's purely restricted to very low density single family housing. And these codes were written at a very different time, right? They were written at a time when people were leaving the city and demand was much lower, and there was a lot of extra housing. And so the thought was, we need to put these caps now that don't allow new housing to be built. And of course, as New York City sort of had a little bit of a renaissance beginning in the 90s, and that might be ending now, unfortunately, under de Blasio's reign, people were coming back to the city and there was demand for housing. But what had changed is that the regulations didn't allow new housing to be built to accommodate it. And housing is like any other product. It's a function of supply and demand. If you have high and rising demand, or more people are moving to the city, or incomes are rising, both of which have been true in New York City recently, there's going to be, you need to build much more housing to accommodate that. But what we've had is we have demand rising, but we don't allow the sort of commensurate amount of supply to be added. And that's why, you have more people with more dollars bidding on the same amount of housing. And that's why housing prices go up. And that's why people like Aunt May and Peter Parker, kind of struggle to get by.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just one of these moments where, the market constantly has to react. One of the things that I've been talking about with many of my guests recently has been, look at the situation of just comic book stores, for example. Let's look at a macro level. Let's look at comic book stores. Well, comic book stores are now competing against bigger retails, the Barnes and Nobles of the world. And now with DC Comics specifically, they're going to be actually taking some of the best performing DC Comics titles, Batman, Detective Comics, Superman Action, and Justice League, and they're going to start selling directly to people as you walk into Walmart. So what does it do with these specialty stores? I mean, very, very early on in the 90s, when you had the speculator market brought about by a lot of people that made a lot of money during the baseball card situation, where people were just completely like spiking the prices because they thought it was just going to keep going and going and going. You're having these people buy comics that they think are going to end up paying for their kids' college tuition. But then what happens? You have a bunch of people buying them, then they find out that they're basically worthless because they printed so damn many. And then for all these comic book stores, as much as I love my individual comic shops, there were just too many. And over the last 20, 30 years specifically, we've seen them begin to narrow down. around. And even in the age of like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and everyone, and their cousin knows about Iron Man and Captain America, they thought that this demand for comic books specifically would go up. And it's like, well, it did in some ways, but more people were going towards digital books. Some people were going towards the bigger retailers. So now your local comic shop is almost the equivalent to like a vinyl record store. It's nice to have, but it's going down. And it's because the market changes and people have to go ahead and adapt to it. And sometimes the things we like tend to go away as a result of it. I might not like it, but it's the world we live in. With government, it doesn't act that way. I think it was Ronald Reagan who once said that there's nothing more permanent than a government agency or law or regulation. And I mean, New York alone is one of those situations. And I don't know if you remember, but do you remember Jimmy McMillan?
Rings a bell. Yeah.
The rent is too damn high guy.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. He ran for governor of New York State, saying the rent is too damn high, and a lot of
very agreeable platform, I would add. Yeah.
Yeah. His problem though was not to get rid of zoning and all the other stuff. It was just to go ahead and actually, like essentially confiscate private property, and the state would go ahead and assess what was a fair rent. And I mean, what do people actually in New York have to think about this? Because we can blame the government all we want, but at the end of the day, you've got enough people that end up voting these same people back. Obviously, somebody has to be addressing these issues somehow, because you've got to live somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately they've kind of let the crisis just run rampant. Housing prices have been going up and up and up. And increasingly, working class people are priced out of city, and they're moving to states like North Carolina and Florida. There are, I think you made a really good point, there are these sort of non-solutions that keep coming up. One is rent control, which is this fantasy that, well, if prices are going up because demand has risen and supply, we're not allowing supply to increase to accommodate that. Oh, well, we just need to have controls on the price. But what you get in these circumstances is people just pull units off the market. At the most extreme example, you had people literally burning down apartment buildings, landlords burning down apartment buildings in the Bronx in the 1970s because it just didn't pencil to maintain the building. They couldn't afford the property taxes. They couldn't afford the maintenance. That's an extreme example, but that is
were they doing it? Were they doing it like to collect the insurance money?
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh wow.
So it's a liability to have the building standing and with tenants who are part of a rent control program. Because after it goes on for so long, the increments that the rent can increase fall so out of sync with inflation and other sort of macroeconomic conditions, as you were talking about, that it literally becomes reasonable for developers to or for landlords to destroy the building. And so this is why you had this famous, Bronx is, ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning, sort of moment. I don't think we're anywhere near that, God willing, but this is sort of the path you get on when the policies are so out of sync with reality. And another one of these sort of ideas that is popular, but a non-solution is it's essentially requiring the developers set aside, 20% of the units, and then the market rate units are going to cross-subsidize and pay for these, heavily below market units. But the problem is that this only pencils when the market rate rentals are so incredibly expensive that there's extra money that they can skim off and use to pay for the 20% of units that aren't paying market rate. And so, again, they keep coming up with these solutions that don't address the fundamental problem, which is that the regulation's not allowing housing to be built. That is the fundamental problem. And until that's addressed, the housing crisis is not going to be fixed. And people like Aunt May are going to keep getting evicted. Or people like Peter Parker are going to keep, scrapping and scrounging to get by.
And I mean, it's one of these situations where at least for people like us that think like us, the answers are clear. But it seems like a lot of these central planners are just continuing to double down on a system that it isn't working for anybody. And I don't really think this is a political issue at all. I mean, I know New York City liberals and the few conservatives that are there and the libertarians amongst them. Everyone addresses this as an issue. What's the incentive of the city to keep things the way they are? Because we've got a joke here in Virginia. We call them halfbacks. They're people from New York and New York State broadly who move down to Florida because they like the weather. Then they realize they don't like it that much. Then they move halfway back to North Carolina and Virginia. So, I mean, what you see there is a lot of people either in the city itself or throughout greater New York, because of taxes and regulations and restrictions on civil liberties, they're starting to realize, the best thing to do for themselves in that situation is to move. And you get enough people moving and not enough people coming in and not enough people staying. I mean, you look at New York right now amongst the protests, the riots, and the pandemic. The photos that outsiders are looking at during street views and everything else, it looks like things are not going to be back to normal. So the obvious thing in my mind would be give people an incentive to move back or to move here and start fresh. Where's the logic in keeping things the way they are?
It's an excellent question. I mean, I think for sure a big part of what's going on. I mean, a lot of people want to live in New York. New York's a great place in so many respects.
It's that classic American idea that, you go to New York to get a fresh start. You go there to live out your dream. And many people do that, and then they go there and then they end up broke.
Right. Well, I think the fact that New York has so much power over the American mind, right? So many people want to live there, they want to visit. But then you go there and so many just basic things are not being managed correctly. And it's sad to see. I mean, it really is, because it's really a governance problem. But why? You asked a very good question, which is why does this sort of perpetual housing shortage persist if we can just change the regulations? And really, it's a cronyism story. If you currently own property in the city, a shortage is great for you because the value of your asset is just going to keep rising. And so what happens when you have a group of people who are saying, hey, we need to build more housing, is people who already own property come up with a million different reasons why, we shouldn't do it. Oh, well, the subway is too crowded here. We can't have more people here. There's going to be too much extra traffic. We can't allow a few extra apartments to be built. We don't want the character of the neighborhood to change, which is kind of a loaded term, right? In the American context, right? It could be, racial or sort of exclusionary undertones. But so, whenever you have a proposal to actually build some housing, you have a lot of people who are landlords or they're property owners, and they show up and they say, they come up with reasons why the development should be allowed to exist. But at the end of the day, the status quo benefits them. More housing would only mean their investment going down in value. And so you have a real sort of, a cronyism issue at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I mean, when you look at, I'm not pointing out anyone specifically because I mean, the issue isn't just Democrats. It's not just progressives. It's not really an ideological thing. It all has to do with the mechanisms of control. That's all it comes down to, the mechanisms of control. And I, as somebody that only drove through New York one time, and ironically, I was going to go on March 23rd. My girlfriend and I were going to fly to New York and hang out with some friends. And I wanted to go to Staten Island to Midtown Comics and maybe see Hamilton. And that was when the travel restrictions and everything started. So I've still got my Southwest miles. Hopefully I'll be able to make it one day. But I first got my taste of New York.
Midtown Comics is totally worth it.
That's all I want to see. Like literally, if I could just go up for a day, because it's only 4 hours from where I am. If I could just go to Midtown Comics, just spend a ton of money, and then come back with a bunch of long boxes in the back of my car, I'd be totally happy. All I want. Very basic things. But my first kind of experience dealing with, New York politics and New York cronyism to a larger degree was in 2015. I was an intern at Freedom Works, and I was writing a series of articles discussing what was going on with Uber and Lyft in the city. And this was really one of those experiences where it's like I didn't think I was wading into any troubled waters, but man, taxi unions are angry. Like they are not the type of people you want to tick off. And this is coming at a time where essentially Uber and Lyft are now about 2-3 years into operations. You primarily have Uber in the city because what they attempted to do is they tried to actually limit the number of individuals within the city of New York that were actually legally allowed to offer ride sharing services through their car without a medallion. And that went ahead and just caused a lot of problems because two real big things were happening. One, you have a lot of federal money going into the state of New York, and especially in New York City, yet you have a lot of people living below the poverty line. So now you have some people with a car who are able to actually make some side hustle money. That should be seen as a good thing. Put people to work, allow them to earn an income. The other problem, though, is that among the taxi unions, a lot of cabbies will not go into certain parts of the city. They just refuse to go there because they don't think that people are going to pay, or they think they're going to get robbed. They just refuse to do that. So now you've got a large chunk of the urban population that doesn't have access to accessible rideshare opportunities. And the only way they could do that, albeit, actually going into a neighborhood where they can call somebody, was calling an Uber or a Lyft. And it was the hate mail and the vitriol and stuff I got from people within the taxi unions and everything else. It was rough. And I mean, part of me understood why, because you look at the medallion system in itself. These people aren't just mad because I'm attacking what I think is an antiquated system. I don't like taxis because I think they're, especially the ones in DC, the experiences I have not been great compared to riding an Uber or a Lyft. So it's like I could attack them on that part. It's like, maybe if you competed better, you would be doing better against these newer, better services. But at the same time, you look at the medallion system, which is also something that was created out of New York. You have basically generations of people who are, driving their dad's car and their grandpa's car. Well, maybe not the same vehicle, but they have the same medallion authorizing them to operate a cab in New York, not because they love driving people around, but because they're trying to pay that off. Some of those things get to the range of $500,000 or more. So I began to empathize with them because they're not just doing it because they don't want to compete. They're doing it because if they do have to compete, they might not be able to ever get themselves out of this almost public, induced slavery that has happened. People use the term wage slave often. Well, you have medallion slaves right there. It's a horrible system. And why does it exist? It exists because a couple people who had the authority to do so made some backroom deals, and now you have this situation.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, they're victims, right? The decades ago, politicians and the taxi companies came together and said, let's form a cartel, right? And what happened when you had a legally sanctioned cartel is service got worse, prices went up, nobody liked it at all. Uber and Lyft come along and they solve a real problem, which is like, as you said, dramatically better, essentially taxis is what they are. And I do very much sympathize for the people who bought into this cartel. I mean, I think especially for the smaller operators, my preferred solution would just buy them out, like buy the medallions back and shut the whole system down and have an open market in taxi and ride hailing, right? That's the way to do it. All right. You say to the person who's had the medallion, and they paid, $1 million for, because they were getting north of, I think, 7 figures by right when Uber and Lyft came along, and God help anyone who bought one, a week before Uber was invented, right? Couldn't get more select than that. I'm totally sympathetic. Just pay them out, buy them out. We're shutting down the system. We're going to have sort of an open market in this, and we're going to have, anybody who wants one can come and, pass a test and you're good to go, right? Like, you don't need this like artificially constrained market. And your point's exactly right that there really were equity issues with the old system. I mean, this is what happens with cartels, and it's the same thing that happens with rent control. When you as a landlord can't pick tenants based on who's going to just pay you the most money, which is like how most transactions work, you start selecting based on other factors. And we have evidence that, people would be like, oh, well, like, I'm not going to rent to certain people. Right. And that certain people ends up, having sort of a racial dimension or a classist dimension. And really the only sort of equitable way to do this is to allow these markets to work, allow prices to reflect actual supply and demand, allow sort of anyone with the gumption to buy a car, slap a sticker on it, or maybe not, and start doing rides for people. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that you often hear is just kind of like a gut reaction when you're saying you want to deregulate is, well, that just means there'll be no standards. That just means anyone will do this, and it'll just be utter anarchy. And I mean, so you know a little bit about me. My background really, when I was in like the policy world and the political world, was in education reform. And you know, I was a big advocate, not just specifically for homeschooling, but for competitive alternatives to the public education system we have now. And you would always get these parents who look at my proposals and the stuff I'm talking about, and they're like, well, this just means there'll be no standards, and you know, parents won't be able to really measure their kids' success and everything else. And all I had to tell them was like, name any specific industry that doesn't have a existing degree of self-regulation, whether it's vehicles, whether it's anything else. You know, a lot of the internal regulations you'll see come from self-imposed governing bodies, whether they're individual labs that are testing for quality and safety, whether they're mutually agreed upon organizations that are funded by competing companies to keep each other accountable in a voluntary way. You know, people have this natural understanding that, you know, in order to compete and in order to give people a better product and a better service, there's always going to have to be a degree of self-regulation. But that's the thing. When you're actually working with, you know, your peers and your colleagues, and even to a degree your opponents, things can change. Things are done in a way that's not going to lead to the absolute detriment of an entire industry. Government doesn't work that way. And I don't understand. Well, I guess I do kind of understand, but there's always this gumption that without any type of, you know, government involvement, everything's just going to go to hell. And it's like, well, you look at the situation in terms of, you know, housing in New York City alone, and it's like this is entirely brought about because of government control.
Yeah, I mean, to give you another example of that, you know, self-regulation from zoning, you know, so there's a zoning requirement in many cities which says that you can't have a unit that's smaller than so many square feet. And, you know, the sort of theoretical justification for this is that we have to prevent units from being so small that they're unlivable. But who determines whether they're unlivable, right? Right now, there's enormous interest in things like tiny houses. You know, if you're a young bachelor or a bachelorette moving to the city for the first time, you know, a 200 square foot studio might really be all you need. You know, space for a bed, a bookshelf, a bathroom, and then, you know, a little tiny kitchenette. That, you know, there have been many points in my life and the lives of many people I've known where that's all that might be perfect for you for a year if that gets you into a city where you can get a great job, or if that helps you be near, you know, a loved one. But, you know, what zoning comes along and does, it says, oh, well, if you know, every apartment has to be at least 800 square feet. And so if you can't afford that, tough, you're not allowed to live here. And you see this a lot with single family homes. You'll have a lot of suburbs say, oh, the home has to be at least 2,000 square feet. Well, okay, traditionally, you know, plenty of homes were built that were around 1,000 square feet, right? That's a good starter home, you know, for a young couple, maybe with a baby. 1,000 square feet, if that's what it takes for them to get their foot in the door, that's fantastic. And this is the real kind of common theme here, is that there is a source of regulation. If a developer builds an apartment or a single family home that's too small, that's actually too small, nobody's going to rent it and nobody's going to buy it. And they're going to be holding the bag, and there's going to be a market signal. Same thing with parking requirements. A lot of cities will say, oh, if you want to build a 10-unit apartment building, you also have to have a 10 parking space garage. And regardless of, you might be in a neighborhood, you might be a block away from a subway, and everyone who lives in that building is going to take the subway, and they're not going to own a car. But you have a regulation saying, oh, well, the minimum that everybody needs is one parking space. And what this means is that you just get more expensive apartments, and people who might not otherwise have wanted a parking space now have to pay for one. And again, it's this idea that a regulator or a politician's judgment should supersede, you know, the actual parties to the transaction. If I'm a renter and I want a parking space, I will go out and rent a space with a parking space. If I don't want one, I won't rent one. There's your sort of regulation, right? A developer, if a developer is worried that, you know, if she's not confident that she can rent out a unit without a parking space attached to it, she will build that parking space, right? Like these things are sort of resolved by housing markets. But what you have in so many cities is they preempt these decisions and they say, well, no, we're going to have a floor and we're going to sort of impose our sort of values on everyone. And it's really been a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, it's just funny because all these situations are almost, I mean, everything has a good intention put to it. At least that's what, many claim when it comes to the adverse results of many so-called good ideas. It's the fatal conceit, plain and simple. I began to really understand that the issue of housing, I always felt like it should have never been a political issue, but everything is a political issue. What things you buy now is a political issue. It's a interesting time to be alive. I'll never forget. I was in Prince George, Virginia, and I want to say 2018, 2019. It was probably in the fall. And, I'm speaking on behalf of a candidate I'm working for, and I'm at this little local candidate forum. And I mean, when it comes to just, I think it was a senatorial race, but a lot of the topics being discussed, because there were many other races there, a lot of them were real local issues, and one of the issues was housing. And Prince George, I mean, it's a pretty rural middle class community, and what you have is a lot of contractors from the Beltway who eventually decide to go out there because you could buy a lot of land and, a big, nice house very cheaply. So you have a lot of people from the Beltway moving out, more inland in Virginia. And, the Democrats were saying that, we need to go ahead and bring in more affordable housing. And it seemed like the Republicans were just kind of, they didn't want to get involved with it because it always became either a classist or a racial issue. We don't want some people coming in because who's most likely going to move into those affordable housing. And I mean, in Virginia, we have one of the largest immigrant communities in the United States right now. Many people who are coming in from, South Korea, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. It's a big melting pot community here. So it was always somehow related to that. But you had one, elderly gentleman that came up to the microphone to put his 2 cents in. And he was basically like, listen, a lot of us don't want this affordable housing here because our tax dollars are going to have to go ahead and, build up these new, apartment complexes and, Section 8 housing and everything else. And it's like, if there was an actual need for it, there would be developers coming in because that's just another way to make money. But what you're basically doing is you're creating an artificial system where you're incentivizing people to come here and live in this housing, whereas there's other options throughout Virginia. It just seems like this is a situation where you're getting people involved in this whole process. But the big issue is that, essentially homeowners don't want the value of their homes to go down. And a lot of people think that this is also going to cause an undue burden on taxpayers. And I mean, tell me what jobs are opening up, because you keep saying, it's going to give more opportunities to work. It's like, well, if people thought that way, they would be moving here regardless. People will move when their wallets are, pointing them in a certain direction. It's just this misunderstanding that when you allow just basic free market principles to work, it's going to provide housing to a degree. It might not be great, but it will provide a degree of housing to people who might not otherwise be able to live in a house. I mean, in America, and maybe this is just my opinion, but like we have a large population of people who live below the poverty line who are dying from obesity. I'm not calling that progress, but in the majority of human history, most people have died from starvation. What I'm basically trying to get at, and maybe I'm not doing the best way of saying it, it's like there's always a way for the market to provide. It might not be the best way, but the market will always provide.
Yeah, I think in the Prince George case, it's interesting because there are really two ways to think about, quote unquote, affordable housing, right? There's housing that's inherently just more affordable, but it doesn't require any kind of subsidy. Mm-hmm. So apartments are generally more affordable than single family homes on their own lot, right? Yeah. Manufactured housing is going to be a little bit cheaper than site-built housing. And so with that form of affordable housing, a lot of times, you do have cases in a case like Prince George's County or, municipalities within the county where they do make it virtually impossible for developers to come in and build that. So in many American suburbs, they just completely ban apartments outright. So let's say I owned a home and I had a detached garage. and I wanted to turn that garage into an extra apartment unit, and I wanted to lease it out. Those are called accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. In many U.S. suburbs, a code inspector would come by and issue me citations until I destroyed that extra apartment. And so the ADU is affordable housing in the sense that it's generally going to be very cheap, and it might provide a space for, maybe a young college student, or, a retiring widow, or someone like that, coming back to the Peter Parker Aunt May theme, which is the springboard for all of this. And so in that sense, it is really over-regulation that keeps people from coming in. And in many cases, in some cases, we've structured our local tax system such that children are a burden on local systems, and we need to kind of resolve that fundamental issue. But we really do. Your point is correct, which is that if you clear away a lot of the rules that make it very hard for developers to come in and build the housing that needs to be built, they will come in and build it. And two, there's a bigger question here of how do we think about, because there's a certain number of people who most likely, no matter what, the market is not going to be building sufficient housing for them. So people who, maybe they have a severe disability, or, they're retired and they have no savings whatsoever. And so we do need to think of some sort of way to help those people. And I think that it's very similar to the education context, where traditionally the solution was, we will build the housing the government will build the housing for you. We'll build public housing, or we will give money to a developer to build housing for you. I think really the right approach to it is giving people vouchers and saying, here's some money. I would just prefer it to be cash, right? If somebody is destitute and they need help, just give them cash. We don't need to have this big welfare bureaucracy, or give them, a voucher that they can then go and give it to an apartment, or, a particular unit where it's appropriate for them, given their needs, right?
Yeah.
We do have the system in the U.S. where we think the government needs to build and own and manage all the affordable housing. And, that just hasn't really worked out very well. But we could, sort of refocus and say, here's a voucher, you decide. You decide where to live. You go out and rent a private home wherever it's best for you. And really, that system is just better both for the renter and for society, in the sense of helping the people who are really at the margins.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to home ownership, I'm 25. I've got a lot of friends that are now getting married and they're starting families, and they're moving into the suburbs, or they're moving into more areas that are better for families. And I mean, it's just one of these strange things that a lot of problems were always there. I guess now I'm suddenly catching up to understand them. But you want to talk about institutions that just have way too much authority. One thing that I've learned to hate recently are homeowners associations. My God. Yeah. It is like a little plutocracy. My parents, they got into a tiff a while back with their HOA, because when they wanted to go ahead and put their clippings out on the street for the garbage to come by, there was a specific HOA guideline that said they have to put all clippings in clear recyclable trash bags, and everything else could go in a garbage bag. And I mean, the question was okay, well, can you at least tell us if they're going somewhere different? What's the big difference of that? And you're specifying this. You want them clear and you want them recyclable. Are you going to go ahead and provide them because they're more expensive when we don't want to spend the money on that? I mean, it's a very side thing. It might not sound really related to this, but I think in a whole, the issue is very simple. It's that we have this very strange relationship between owners of private dwellings and other systems, whether they be, a voluntary system like a homeowners association, or whether you're dealing with cities or states actually trying to mess with housing. There's only a degree of freedom. And I mean, I think the quintessential American dream used to be own a house with a white picket fence and a dog and 2.5 children. And now what we're really beginning to see is that this is the whole housing situation nationwide. It's different place to place, but it's becoming really, really strange. And I personally think that because of what we're seeing now with the pandemic and the easy way that people now have access to lines of credit now and everything else, we're seeing a housing bubble. because a lot of people who, would otherwise be able to own a home eventually, now they're able to go ahead and get a loan now, and they're moving into these homes that it's not like they're getting subprime mortgages. It's not that situation, but we're creating this system where now it's like, okay, a lot of people are going to be able to move into a home and they're going to be able to own something for once. I think it's gonna burst. I really do. This whole thing just seems it does not look sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, to your HOA point, I mean, these are the kind of busybodies who also show up at planning meetings and will sort of lobby against, the development next door, right? So, I live in a small little, neighborhood. I'm the president of the HOA, and I see a proposal, a developer wants to develop the farm across the street from us. And then I show up and I call my council member and I'm saying, we can't allow this to have happened, right? Which is completely hypocritical because, it's like, well, your subdivision was on an old farm, right? But, people have this idea of like, oh, all development stops once I've arrived. I have mine and I'm pulling up the ladder and nobody else can build any more housing here and no one else can live near me. And, to your point about housing prices, I mean, it is kind of incredible because in many of these areas where the prices have gone up because we've sort of had this regulatory induced housing scarcity, it is a problem because people have like assumed that their home values are going to be incredibly high and they're going to keep going up to their entire lifetime. And, in certain cases where demand just didn't accommodate that, the solution was like, oh, well, let's like radically reduce supply. Like, let's not allow any new housing to be built. And so the value of my house is going to go through the roof. And so that's good for the person who won the lottery and bought a home maybe in the right place. But that's terrible for the millions of people who might want to move to that city or that region, because then it becomes much, much more expensive for them. And this is something we've seen more broadly is that Americans don't move nearly as much as they did in past decades. Beginning around the 1970s and 1980s, Americans just kind of stopped moving. Historically, Americans, we were very mobile. We would go to the city or the region where there was jobs, where there was work. And we've stopped doing that. And one of the sort of hypotheses of why that happened is that housing has just become so much more expensive. If you want to move, let's say you're a computer engineer and you want to move to the Bay Area, your income might double, right? But your housing costs are going to quadruple. So why would you ever do that? And why would you move to this region? And we're all poor in the sense that you would have been most productive as a computer engineer by moving to San Francisco. You could have joined a larger firm that's doing incredible and innovative things. But what you do instead is you say, well, I'm going to stay where I am because all of my additional earnings are going to be eaten up by high housing costs. So I don't move to the Bay Area.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
if you're a finance whiz, and same with New York, right? You might have somebody in North Dakota who could sort of drive us toward the next big fintech financial technology innovation, and they look at rents and they look at the cost of moving to New York and they say, it's probably not worth it. I'll just stay here. And I'm not knocking North Dakota, but we want people to be able to move to the places where they can be most productive. And if you have regulatory barriers that are preventing that, it's incredibly destructive in the long term.
Yeah, and I mean, you brought up something which is just, I mean, it's so odd. I had a conversation with an old college roommate of mine. He was a communications major. I did political science. We both went into the media realm after graduation. And he got a job working for one news outlet, basically doing the same thing I was doing for another place around here. But he got paid 4 times as much. And one of the requirements was you have to move to Los Angeles. So without really thinking about it, he's like, wow, I get 4 times as much income if I move there versus I'm doing the exact same thing over here. And what he learned real fast was that like 3/4 of it were just eaten up with expenses. And within a year and a half, I mean, this guy was already paying off tons of student loans and everything else. His net worth was incredibly negative, which, I mean, a lot of people don't think that could be them. But when you look at your average college graduate, they've got a negative net worth of at least 40K. That's your average American, regardless of what school they're going to. They are negative the moment they walk out the door. And here he is thinking, here I am taking this giant step in my life, and I'm already doing ahead of most of my peers when you compare us income-wise. But when you look at our ability to save, invest, actually have, some cash on hand instead of just living on credit constantly, he was doing worse. So he moved back to Virginia for a remarkably reduced salary doing something else. Yet he is doing far much better financially because he chose to do that. And it really only came down to one thing. It was the location.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it in the aftermath of the coronavirus. I think this is the cities that are really going to be hurting are the cities that have just had completely runaway housing affordability crises. New York City, San Francisco, potentially LA, maybe a handful of other cities. But these are cities that, a lot of people, like I said, they want to live there, right? Like, when I was growing up, San Francisco always seemed like kind of a neat aspirational place to want to live. Maybe I watched too much Full House. But it seems like a nice, good weather year-round kind of place. Interesting culture, very sort of libertarian in the cultural sense. But people have just sort of said like, hey, look, it's just not worth it at the cost. I mean, you're looking at like $4,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. Even if you're earning like $150,000 as like a tech whiz working for Google, like it's just not worth it. And so, that person's going to look at the math and they're going to say, yeah, I'm going to leave. And then like we're all going to be poorer as a result because all these smart people are leaving the region where they could have been the most productive. Like if you wanted to be a media person or your friend wanted to be a media person, Los Angeles might have been the place where he or she could have really made the most out of their career. But what ends up happening is, they look at the math, they look at the rents, and they say, "I'll move back to Virginia." And I'm not knocking any place. In fact, Virginia's, God bless them for being more affordable. And it's fantastic that a lot of parts of the U.S. have continued to build enough housing to keep housing prices and rents sustainably low. But it is really a shame that we've done this in really a handful of superstar cities. And, we're already sort of seeing the mobility patterns. And, for San Francisco, it's not pretty.
Yeah, I mean, this is just, it's, we started with housing and we've been able to really look at all these different factors moving in. I can assume that we're close in age. I don't really know anyone in our generation who is looking at maybe the next 5-10 years from now thinking, I can actually own a home. Or maybe they want to, but they just think it's not economically feasible for me to own a home. And in many ways, like, Northern Virginia, where I'm at right now, is remarkably different than the rest of the Commonwealth. I went to school at Liberty University, and if you want a job that makes you $40,000 in Lynchburg, between, let's say, Lynchburg and Danville, Danville, and Roanoke, you could buy a home with a little bit of land, and your cost of living is super low, and you can have what is really considered by many a very middle-class life. You make $40K in Northern Virginia, and you better have like 7 roommates piled upon each other, and you never drive. You bike everywhere. And it's becoming the situation where we're really beginning to see very large pockets of the country beginning to spread outward. And many people are really beginning to think, okay, like what does it mean to be financially successful or to be successful career-wise if I'm just destroyed financially? Because I think we can all think of a few of our rich friends, because everyone has those rich friends who look like they're doing well, but they're eating out all the time. They don't have proper financial habits. They're living off of credit. They're not saving. They're not investing. They're not looking long term. And when situations like, we've seen with the pandemic come, and let's say they're out of work, or let's say like when I was at the Washington Times, we had a salary reduction, 10%, you cut that off the top. Yeah, that's fine for some people. But for people that weren't making much, that 10% is the difference between I can live here and I've got to move. It's this coalescing of majorities of the population that are beginning to look at where they're at, and I mean we've got to really change the way we look at finances, what we see as being financially healthy in our own right, and just what the cost of all this busybodying in terms of the market can do. Because I'm not saying we need to just completely destroy every regulatory agency overnight. It's not feasible. There are very few people that think that way. But at the same time, we can at least look at the problems like what we're seeing with housing in New York and say, listen, we've tried this, we doubled down on this, and this just isn't working.
Right. It's a great point. I mean, it'll be really interesting to me where we're moving to this remote work paradigm. It'll be interesting to me to see, number one, we don't know how many people are going to go full remote permanently. I think what's going to be most common is people will work remotely 1 or 2 days a week. And so how are sort of, where people want to live, how is that going to be affected, right? If you're full remote, how many what percent of people who go full remote leave the metro area that they currently live in? We don't know. If someone doesn't have to go into work, let's say Monday and Friday, will they tolerate a much longer commute, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? We don't know, right? So if let's say you work in downtown DC and, when this coronavirus thing ends, if it ever ends, God willing. Find out that, right. You find out that Monday and Friday, you don't have to go into the office. Does that free you up? And you're like, okay, cool. I'm going to move to Charlottesville because I've always wanted to live in Charlottesville, and I will just suck it up and have a brutal commute for those 3 days. These are things that could happen, and we really don't know. For a city like DC or a city like San Francisco or a city like New York, I think what they need to be doing is they need to be saying, what are let's do an inventory, right? Let's do an audit of how we do things. And if people are leaving, there's a signal there. It might be that they're leaving because of the schools, or they're leaving because the housing costs are too high, or they're leaving because the transit is unreliable, to give a DC example, or they're leaving because the street maintenance isn't great. People have options when remote work becomes the norm. And this should really just discipline cities to really figure out, what are the regulatory barriers standing in the way of a higher quality of living? And what are the sort of public service quality issues that we need to resolve? And if they think of it that way, this whole thing could be very productive. Based on what we've seen in New York City, it doesn't look like they're going to take that route. But for cities that are a little bit better governed, this is still an option on the table. How can we get better? How can we be a place that people with options want to live?
Absolutely. And I mean, we're in a strange new world. I personally think that, the next struggle, because there's always some type of us versus them struggle, I think it's really going to become, this big schism between people that can work remotely and people that don't have the option of that. This was something that I didn't think I'd be able to, I had to leave media. I have a new job now where I work fully remote, but it's this is something that if I had stayed where I was at, I wouldn't be able to really do this for what I think, at least in terms of me, 10 years. Now,
that's a really great point. Yeah. Yeah.
And now it's go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think with the media is going to miss this because most people in the media are able to work remotely. And I think they are going to be talking about the coronavirus from that perspective. And I think you're totally right that it's missing this crucial perspective of, most people are not going to have the luxury of being able to work remote. And for them, things are very difficult. I'm active on, social media and, on Twitter, for example, and I have to just constantly remind myself, this is an incredible bubble, right? The people who are able to sort of work remotely, and you really have to check that.
Yeah, you're so right. And I mean, this is maybe there's a bit of a sidebar, but I did a lot of commentary and I did very little reporting. And, what I like to do is I like to consider myself a commentary journalist. I usually like to go actually investigate a story, but at least put my spin in it. So it's I like to put in the work. I'd like to travel. I'd like to go do things. I like to, at least try and give everything a real objective look. Unlike what I think a lot of reporters are doing. You have a lot of reporters that think that they're commentators, and you have a lot of commentators that pretend to be reporters. And when you do that, you just muddy the waters. It makes everything bad. But it bothers me how many reporters now. And I think people forget, reporting used to be a very blue collar job. You don't make a lot of money doing it. But now what you had this, a lot of over credentialized young people from what I saw and what from a lot of my mentors saw. And it's now you can report about a story about something that happened on the other side of the world and you don't even have to leave your room. And when that happens, you see this schism between the people on the left and the right who don't like the media and everyone else.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
rough, and I get it, but it's like you said, this is going to be something where if they miss it, it's going to cause a lot of people to get angry real fast.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we just need to keep in mind that, people are experiencing this pandemic in different ways, and I think that should inspire some humility.
Absolutely. So Nolan, we're running up on time. Here's the last question I want to ask you, and this is the one I've actually been really, excited to ask you. I'm really happy we have this conversation. I've learned a ton, and I can tell you up front, this is something that never would have crossed my mind. Housing and all this other stuff, it's just not one of those topics that ever really entered my wheelhouse. But what I loved about your video, and folks, I'm going to link to it in the show notes. I had to watch it a couple times because I had to take notes the second time. There's just a lot in there. But you caught me because you spoke about Spider-Man. And the crux of your series, correct me if I'm wrong, is going to be looking at these things from, using pop culture as kind of like the launching ground to discuss these grander ideas. Where did this idea come from? Were you a comic fan? Is this something that you wanted to do? Or did you just think, let's meet most people where they are and bring them conversations that they wouldn't have thought about going to?
I would like to say that, we had this sort of philanthropic, let's bring it to where the plebs are. But it was very much just, I love, talking about these issues in terms of pop culture. I'm a huge Spider-Man fanatic. I just played the PS4 game.
Oh my God,
which I see the poster for in the background.
Dude, I took a sick day from one of my old jobs to play it when it came out. There's no way I couldn't have.
Incredible game. I was living in New York when I was playing it, and they did such a fantastic job. But, I was writing these sort of pieces. I was writing the housing politics of Spider-Man, or I was writing about a story about the Fallout, series of video games and how cities work in those. And I got to talking with some people, and, we kind of agreed, like, oh, this is actually a really good way to frame some of these issues, right? Because, like, if I were to just start talking to you about zoning, your eyes would glaze over, right? And
it's not a sexy topic.
Not sexy in the least, right? But when you sort of frame it in the sense of, like, hey, Spider-Man has housing affordability issues. Why is that? You come to people where they're at, and you can really make you humanize the issue, right? If I start talking to you about height limits or floor area restrictions or minimum parking requirements, this stuff, it'll put you to sleep. But if you can frame it in terms of, hey, how much does Aunt May's house cost? Like, oh, why does Peter Parker live in an SRO in Spider-Man 2? Why do in so many entries in the extended universe, why do Aunt May and Peter Parker do homeless outreach, right? There's themes here that people who are
when you included that from Spider-Man Far From Home, I must have completely glossed over that scene, but it's consistent with everything from Spider-Man.
Right. I mean, and Spider-Man, the PS4 game. Right, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but Aunt May is heavily involved in a homeless shelter, and things go a little awry. I won't ruin it. Everyone should go play it. But so there are these incredible themes, and you find this so much. I mean, the second video was on Avatar: The Last Airbender, and it's kind of the same thing. There are cities, and there are sort of issues that people are thinking about. Historic preservation or racial segregation within cities. And, these are very wonky, potentially charged issues that if you can frame them in a way that people feel comfortable and people feel like you're actually deepening their understanding of something else they love, so you had a lot of people watching the second video, and they were like, I love Avatar, and I could care less about urban planning. And I certainly could care less about, like, zoning. But I feel like I now understand more about Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I really appreciate that. And that's cool, right? Like, if I produce something that people love, and I'm working with a great director, Calvin Tran, and Pacific Legal Foundation has been very generous in supporting it. But if we can produce a product that people love and enjoy, and maybe they learn a little bit about these important issues, that's just a home run in my book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with your series, and especially with the Spider-Man episode, because that's just close to my heart right there. I mean, meeting people where they are, it really validates the old saying, politics is downstream of pop culture. And most of the time you got to meet people where they are. And as somebody that, enjoyed writing white papers at one point in my life, I certainly understood. It's like, I could do this, but what's going to impact people more? This really nice white paper that maybe a couple of staffers on the Hill will read, or something that meets people in the conversations that they're already having. And I can tell you, you've totally changed the way I view Spider-Man forever now.
I hope for the positive.
Absolutely. Nolan, this has been a great talk, incredibly informative. I'm going to link to your videos and everything else in the show notes for today. If people want to follow you, check out the series and everything else that you're doing, how can they do so?
Yeah, well, so we are on YouTube. Our videos are generously sponsored by and hosted by the Pacific Legal Foundation, so check out their YouTube. We actually just had a video come out today, and we have a few more videos in the pipeline, some video game topics. We do have some additional comic subjects coming up, so you'll be particularly excited about that. I'm active on most social media platforms. You can follow me at Nolan Gray, NOLANGRAY. Come be a part of the conversation. Tell me what topics you want to see. We're pretty much wide open, and I found that a lot of people have actually very sophisticated fan theories about cities for products that I never knew there was an urbanism angle on. So I love it. So come at me with all you've got.
Absolutely. Well, folks, that's all I've got. One favor I'm going to ask, please go ahead. If you enjoy conversations like this, I bring it to you 2 days a week for free. I'm not asking for much. Go ahead and leave us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. It's the hub of everything podcast. And share this episode with a friend, whether they're into the housing scene and everything else, or whether they're like most of us and they want to talk Spider-Man in terms of how we could take examples from this and many other things and apply it to understand the world around us even better. Fiction's the best way to go ahead and talk about the true reflections of our world. As always, go ahead and find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You know how it's done at Hey Remso, HEYREMSO. And on Parler at Remso. I'm the only one there, the only Remso. If you ever see Remso 2 pop up, message them, call them a loser. As always, it's On the Run. I'm Remso W. Martinez. Stay well. Good night.
Check out our other shows and more from the We Are Libertarians network at wearelibertarians.com.